Walt Disney wore many hats in the studio, but it may come as a surprise to some that he rarely directed anything. He did the bulk of his directing in the early days, harkening back to the Alice comedies and the Oswald cartoons. Although he's responsible for a few classics like Steamboat Willie and The Skeleton Dance, most audiences haven't seen the majority of these early shorts. Walt more or less stopped directing around 1930, just when Mickey Mouse was beginning to become an icon. After that, he settled into the role of producer and coordinator. He still had a large say in what went into a cartoon, but the direction fell to someone else. In 1932, he was credited as the director for a brief short called The Parade of the Award Nominees, but the cartoon was only meant to be shown at the 5th Academy Awards ceremony, and it only ran for 2 minutes. It featured the first color appearance of Mickey Mouse, clad in his less-than-iconic green shorts, leading a parade of nominated actors. Another short with Walt listed as the director came in 1934. The Hot Chocolate Soldiers told the story of a war between chocolate and gingerbread people. It was commissioned as part of MGM's movie Hollywood Party. Both of these shorts are incredibly obscure. The parade short was only made available in recent years, and the Hot Chocolate Soldiers sits in a largely forgotten, non-Disney movie. Interesting, but footnotes overall. Walt would go on to direct only one more short in 1935 before vowing to never direct again. That cartoon was The Golden Touch. But our story does not begin with Midas. Instead, in classic Disney tradition, it all started with a mouse. No, not that mouse. Our story begins with the Flying Mouse. The Flying Mouse, released in 1934, tells the story of a little mouse that longs to fly like the birds. He rescues a butterfly from a spider and is amazed when the insect turns into a fairy. As thanks, she grants his wish and gives him a pair of bat wings. The wings cause the mouse to be shunned by birds, bats, and even his own family. He tearfully wishes the wings away, and the fairy grants a second wish, encouraging him to be himself. Where this short ties into The Golden Touch is the execution of one particular gag. At an early point, the mouse tries to fly with a pair of makeshift wings. He gets caught in the breeze and winds up landing on a thorn. Walt Disney really wanted this to be the big gag in an otherwise emotional cartoon without much in the laughs department. Side note, Walt seemed to have a thing about posteriors. The short's director, David Hand, was dubious about how well this gag would work. Here's what he had to say. Quote, "The mouse was being blown backward through the air out of control. He was a sympathetic character in a sad plight. The laugh gag was that his rear would make a bullseye into a large thorn sticking out of a rosebush stem. When the picture got to me, I decided to play the impaling idea down as much as possible. Walt insisted that I make the thorn long, dark, and sharp, and that the mouse's rear end get buried up clear to the hilt. And further to this, that I have the music build up to a screech accent. That poor mouse." Unquote. The scene, as you can see, is not quite as painful as Walt wanted, and it's not very funny either. It got 0 laughs when it premiered. The next day, Walt laid into Hand, telling him he didn't do it right. It had been a while since Walt had directed a true Disney short. It appears that this disagreement played a big part in what led to him directing The Golden Touch. Another thing was the departure of director Burt Gillette, who directed one of their biggest hits at the time, The Three Little Pigs. Walt wanted this short to be special, and put 2 of his top animators on the job, Norm Ferguson and Fred Moore. The short is a retelling of the Greek myth about King Midas, placed in a medieval-looking setting. We open on Midas singing about how much he loves gold. A sprite named Goldie pops up and offers him the power to turn all he touches to gold. Midas accepts without thinking, rudely brushing off Goldie's warning that it might not be all he hopes. The king is happy with his new powers for a few moments, but realizes his golden touch extends to food. Even holding it on a utensil is no good. The food turns to gold when it touches his lips. Faced with starvation, Midas becomes a wreck of his former self and begs Goldie to change him back. He offers everything in return. All he wants is to be normal again and to eat a hamburger. Goldie obliges, and to Midas's delight, the hamburger comes with onions. The short did not go over well. I can't find any records of what critics or general audiences thought at the time. The most I know is that, according to animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, no one in the theater laughed at the part with the hamburger, which was meant to be the big gag at the end. The most important thing was that Walt himself hated the cartoon, describing it as a tremendous flop. Years later, Walt was giving one of his directors, Wilfred Jackson, an earful about something. Jackson fired back with, I recollect you once directed a picture called The Golden Touch. Walt stomped out of the room and returned a moment later, warning Jackson never to mention that movie again. Was The Golden Touch the worst cartoon ever? Hardly. It's not even the worst Disney cartoon ever. I'm not sure what is the worst, but it's certainly not The Golden Touch. However, it's still not a very good cartoon, and at least Walt was able to recognize that. It can be difficult to get an audience to like your character in a TV series or feature-length film, so a short film can sometimes provide an even bigger challenge. Audiences have to get to know someone and become invested in their story in a little under 10 minutes. One reason everyone took to the Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf so quickly was that they didn't get to know their characters merely through their song, though that did help. They got to see the characters in action right away. Fifer and Fiddler Pig demonstrate their lazy and carefree attitudes, Practical Pig demonstrates his initiative, and the wolf is a crafty villain. Rather than see Midas's greed properly demonstrated, he just sits there and tells us in song. You really need to use your limited time wisely in these shorts, and the slow opening moments feel like a waste. There are only two real characters in this cartoon, Midas and Goldie, and neither are particularly likable. Midas is a greedy idiot, and Goldie is a cruel trickster. The most sympathetic character is Midas's cat, who gets turned to gold twice, once by Goldie to demonstrate the Golden Touch, and once by Midas to test his own powers out. Disturbingly, after Midas turns the cat to gold a second time, we never see him turn back. We do come to feel pity for Midas when he's faced with the full consequences of his powers, but it never really seems to land. We don't know him that well, and what we do learn of him doesn't really endear him to us. Goldie is not much better, so we can't really root for him either. There are a few memorable moments, a couple clever gags of Midas using his powers, and a few scares from a golden skeleton, but there's just not that much to write home about in this cartoon. Disney has revisited the story of King Midas over the years, like in Once Upon a Time, Aladdin and the King of Thieves, DuckTales, and the Hercules series. However, those are more based on the myth, not the silly symphony. The 30s Midas, despite Walt's apparent hatred of the short, has actually made a few very minor appearances since then. He and Goldie can be seen in the crowd in the 1936 short Mickey's Polo Team, getting along surprisingly well. In 1953, a comic version of the story was published. Although it changed up some of the character designs and added subjects for Midas, the script was largely the same as the cartoon, complete with Goldie and the hamburger ending. In The Legend of the Three Caballeros, Midas is glimpsed for a second in his chambers, now turned to gold himself. Most recently, and most surprising of all, the second Disney Loves Jazz album features a cover of Midas' song by Madeline Peru. Talk about a deep cut. Both King Midas and Walt Disney's experience with the Golden Touch proved to be a humbling one. Luckily for Walt, he was left with much more than a hamburger. He knew his own limitations, but he also had a better idea of how to get the most out of his characters, and by extension his cartoons. Without the hard lessons learned from the Golden Touch, we might not have gotten Snow White, Pinocchio, and all the following movies. Characters, more often than not, are the foundation of a good story.